This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. I know I've mentioned this before, but one of the things I really like about the way in which Marx sets up his understanding of the economy in the Grundrisse is that he starts to disaggregate the various processes at work within a capitalist mode of production and starts to look at the way in which the different processes intersect and interact with each other. And again, I know I've said this before, but the analogy here would be with the human body, where the heart circulates the blood, oxygen comes through the lungs, the digestive system does its work, the liver and the kidneys do their work, the brain. So these are all the different circuits. And the human being has many intersecting circuits. The result of this is that in medicine there are sort of specialists who, so if you have a problem with the heart, you go to your cardiologist. If you got a problem in your lung, you go to a pulmonary specialist. Go to a neurosurgeon if you're having problems with the brain and mental faculties. So in some ways, Marx breaks the capitalist mode of production down in that kind of way in these different circuits. And one of the circuits that I really want to look at today is the circuit which delivers labor power to the capitalist producers. And this is a very special kind of circuit, and one which has, I think, certain implications for how we understand the positionality of the worker and the positionality of the laborer. So I want to talk about this particular circuit, and the way I would do this is to say, let's look at this circuit process and do what Marx does when he looks at capital in general, which is to say there are certain moments in this process which are key moments. For instance, in the circulation of capital, we have the moment of production, which is different from the moment of buying and selling and realization in the market, which is different also from the mobilization of money capital. Well, the circuit of labor power is going to be very much described in that kind of way. And this is what he does at a certain point in the Grundrisse. So he doesn't really complete it very well, but I'm going to do the completion for you, if you like, and then see what this leads to. So imagine a situation then where you're looking at a working person. And that working person goes out and finds a labor market. And in that labor market starts to look for a position. Now, the working person has no goods to sell in the normal sense. What the working person has to sell is the capacity to create value, the capacity to work and to create value. And that is what the working person is trying to do as a seller of labor power, but not labor power directly, but the capacity to do labor. So I am that working person, I'm in the market, and there I am kind of looking for somebody who wants to buy my talents. And after a bit, maybe, I will, with the experience of the labor market, I will then finally get somebody who will say, yeah, okay, come work for me. So my first moment then is the moment of the labor market. The second moment is what happens to me when I say, okay, you have bought the capacity to create value. What do you want to do with it? I go inside the workplace, and under the direction of the capitalist, I will do various tasks. You do this, you do that, you make this, and you make that, and this is how you do it, and all the rest of it. So the job is entirely directed by the capitalist. The thing that is produced belongs to the capitalist. It's the capitalist idea. Everything belongs to the capitalist. So I'm in there and I'm just doing what I'm told I have to do. I am not in charge, and I don't have control over the labour process. The labour process, in effect, controls me. This is why Marx earlier on talks about this kind of labour as alienated labour. So the second moment in this delivery process is the moment of the labour process itself and the creation of value and the mobilisation of my capacity to make value by under the instructions and under the domination of the capitalist. I do this for a week, and at the end of a week, the capitalist comes to me and gives me money, and that's my wage. And I leave the workplace with money in my pocket. So this is the third moment, because once I have money in my pocket, the capitalist can't tell me what to do with it. Nobody can particularly tell me what to do with it. I am free to do with it what I want. And therefore, the third moment is going to be the moment of money management, if you like, where I take the money and I decide what it is I'm going to do with it. I may save some, I may spend it, I may, all kinds of different things I can do with it, or whatever anybody can do with money. The fourth moment is when I take that money and say, well, actually, I really need to buy commodities which will allow me to reproduce myself. So I go to the grocery store and I go to get food and I go to get clothes and I go and I start to spend my money on commodities. So this is the fourth moment where of the circulation process, where I am actually taking my money and taking it into buying commodities which I need to reproduce, and it may not simply be about my reproduction, it may be for the reproduction of any dependents I have or partners that I have. So I go and this is another moment. So that is, if you like, the fourth moment. The fifth moment is when I take that all back to the place of residence. And I get to the place of residence, and first off, I have to, if you like, pay a certain amount of money to procure a space in which I can reside when I'm not working, which means that I have to lay out some money which I have to pay to whoever owns the land. So I'm going to have to pay either rent or the equivalent of rent in terms of if I buy a plot of land or whatever. So I have some secure space in which I can take the commodities and then set about the process of sort of reproducing myself by feeding myself, by setting up sleeping arrangements and all the rest of it, and maybe socializing with other people. So there is a moment of social reproduction where all of this goes on, and then next morning, if I am refreshed, I will go back into the marketplace. Presumably, I've had a contract for a job for a week, but I may have it just on a day, in which I'll have to go through the whole process all over again. So there's a circulation process. And this is what Marx calls a small circulation process. But it's a circulation process which delivers labor power, the capacity to labor, to the capitalist, so the capitalist can use it to create value and surplus value, get a profit, and do all the things the capital does. So capital, as it were, relies upon this circulation process, the circulation process of labor power, in order to be able to do what capital does. So the two processes relate to each other. It's a bit in the same way that, the circulation of the blood depends upon the pulmonary process. So the two things coexist. And by the way, one of the things I like about that analogy of the human body is you don't end up saying, well, one of these moments is more important than the other. The heart is more important than the lungs, is more important than the kidneys, more important than the brain. It's a ridiculous kind of thing to suggest. They all relate to each other, and if any one of those circulation processes doesn't work, then the system is dead. So if this circulation process of labor doesn't operate properly, then capital stops. So capital depends upon this circulation process in order for it to be able to sort of circulate further and accumulate and do all the things that capital does. But the capitalist then looks at that circulation process, and it has certain qualities which I think are very significant and which we need to take account of. The first is, let's go back over the different moments. Clearly, labor markets are very complicated systems. They can, involve individuals frequently in competition with each other. We can start with that as a version of it. That one of the things about the labor market is that it's individualized. I go to the labor market as an individual. I go with certain qualities and quantities and abilities and all the rest of it, and I try to market my particular qualities. And I'm in competition with other people. And so it's very frequently a competitive structure. And as a competitive structure, it leads me to be sort of pretty individualistic and do all kinds of things of various kinds. And of course, labor markets can get segregated. They can get segmented by religion and race and all these sorts of things. So there's a lot of ways in which we can talk about the diversity and the complexity of contemporary labor markets. Some labor markets are very localized. Some, of course, are international. If I'm a skilled at detecting money laundering, I may end up wandering all over the world and tracking things down. So, labor market is a very, very intricate and complicated affair. And one of the things we have to do, therefore, is to ask what kind of labor market is operating, what are the rules in that labor market, and how can I, as an individual, negotiate a labor market so that I get a job? And once I have the job, in what ways has the labor market influenced the kind of job I can get? And in what ways is the labor market actually really sort of working and functioning as a social institution? Is it regulated, and who regulates it? Is it organized, and if so, who organizes it? So to say that the first moment is the labor market and just leave it at that, I think detracts from the fact that this is a very complicated world into which I launch myself when I go looking for a particular job. So we've got to say that. The same thing applies to labor processes. There are all kinds of labor processes, some of which I may be talented enough to be able to do, some of which I'm hopeless at. And so, again, the labor market and the experience of laboring is very, very intricate and complicated things. Divisions of labor exist. The division of labor, which used to be fairly simple in many respects when Marx was writing, has become much more complicated over time. There's been what we call a detailed division of labor, so that a task that used to be done by one person is now done by 14 different people in 14 different locations. So if we're making an automobile, where are the bits made and all the rest of it? So the labor process is, again, a very complicated thing, and we need to describe in detail the labor process and the kind of experience which the worker has in the labor process, because that is the crucial thing as far as capital is concerned, which is the crucial moment where value and surplus value and profit, that's where it's all initially made before it's sent to market and all the rest of it. But so those 2 points are common points. The point where I become a money manager is one which is not discussed very much. But clearly, it is important, because the rules of a capitalist game, capitalist economy, are that once somebody has money, then they can do with it as they like. They are, quote, free to use that money. They're free to choose. So there's a certain freedom that comes with control over money. Now, it may be an illusory freedom, as for reasons which I'll get to in a minute. But nevertheless, there is this moment in the circulation process where the laborer could do all kinds of, has all kinds of at least legal possibilities. Whether they are in a position to take up any of those possibilities depends. I mean, for example, if somebody is paid a sufficiently significant wage, they may decide to become capitalists and decide to hire other laborers, and off they go. So there are all sorts of possibilities that arrive at this particular moment. But as Marx points out, on the few occasions when he talks about it, very often what the labourer has to do at that moment is to take care and start to do things to, for instance, they may want to save. They may want to save for their old age or save for a rainy day or something of that kind, in which case they will save for a situation in which they may be unemployed. And as Marx points out, well, that's very convenient for the capitalist, because the capitalist will, at some point or other, fire all the people for some reason or other, in which case they will be unemployed, in which case who takes care of them when they're unemployed? Well, they should have savings to take care of themselves. So in a sense, you put upon the worker the task of putting by money and putting by things for a crisis and taking care of things in that kind of way. So, but nevertheless, in principle, the point where the worker has the money is a point of, they can do with money whatever they want to do with money. And in principle, that's the case. In practice, it won't be the case, because most workers, particularly in the time when Marx was writing, would be living from hand to mouth. And it is still the case that a majority of working people in the United States are living from one paycheck to the next paycheck. So they really don't have much choice, even though they have money in their pocket for just a little brief while, and the money comes into their pocket, it almost has immediately to be spent in the market. So, but again, when it comes to the market, the worker has a certain freedom of choice. There is nobody there telling the worker, you've got to buy this commodity or that commodity. The worker decides what it is the worker will buy. And yes, okay, there will be food, and they can decide on spaghetti or couscous or whatever, But there's a moment in the circulation process of the worker, which is a moment of consumer choice. And it's very important to recognize the moment of consumer choice, because that also has a lot to do with the cultural background of the worker, the kind of things that they really would want to set up. And Marx kind of says, well, if they have some free cash, they may want to have newspapers, they may want to have one of his favorite ones to mention, of course, is tobacco, because as far as Marx was concerned, tobacco was a necessity rather than a luxury. So the worker has consumer choice. And there's absolutely nothing to say that the worker should consume this or consume that. And that they're here at this point, therefore, there's an interesting relationship between capital and worker, because the capitalists have to produce consumer goods which the worker wants. And if they produce consumer goods that the workers don't want, then they won't be able to sell them. And so there's a kind of interesting moment when suddenly the worker is in control of things, in the sense that they are going to exercise their consumer choice, and the capitalists, at some point or other, are going to have to produce the kinds of things workers want. And so this relationship between the capitalist producers and capitalist workers becomes an important question at the point of consumption. Then all of the commodities are taken back to the place of residence, the place of rest, the place of now. Here we enter into a realm which Marx does not actually talk about very much, and he's been fairly much criticized for not taking account of what goes on in the point of social reproduction and the reproduction of the labourer in the household. But in practice, he does actually create a couple of very important, or make a couple of very, very important points. The first is this, that yes, all kinds of things can go on at the point of social reproduction. Yes, we know that can happen, and does happen. But there are certain things that, if this circulation of labour capacity is going to work, there are certain things that have to happen in at the point of social reproduction, and that therefore, when you start to look at the flow of this cyclical kind of process of going into work, getting the wages, buying the commodities, coming back, and then going to work next day, again, this cyclical kind of process uh, actually puts a considerable stress upon the processes of social reproduction because certain conditions must be fulfilled. First off, obviously, the worker has to come out of that condition, out of that process of social reproduction, fit enough, well enough, mentally adjusted enough to be able to get back in to do the job of unleashing labor capacity in the labor process. In other words, what one of the conditions which have to be met in the point of social reproduction is that that be fulfilled. The second condition that has to be met is that actually the whole process of consumption and development and all the rest of it that goes on in the point of social reproduction has a linkage back again to the cultures of consumerism. In other words, if the worker goes into and buys all the wrong things in the grocers, they won't, the social reproduction won't work. So there is a relationship, not only in terms of the supply of labor and capacity to create value. It's not only that supply, but there's also a demand which is coming from the social point of social reproduction for certain consumer goods which are going to facilitate the processes of social reproduction. So, so now the point of social reproduction is, of course, a complex point. It has a whole history of the family, whole history of households, whole history of all those kinds of things. And obviously, there's been a great deal of literature about social reproduction, fascinating literature, much of it by Marxist feminists, which is obviously pointing out that the gender biases and all the rest of it which occur are significant, and that therefore the point of social reproduction is a complex situation in which questions which are other than those which have to do with the circulation of labour have become very often prominent and preeminent. Questions of sexuality, questions of child raising, questions of social relations, of security, and all the rest of it. And of course, when we're talking about social reproduction, we're not only talking about what goes on privately in households, families, and all of that. We're also talking about many of the social institutions which surround it, such as those of healthcare, such as those of education, and the like. So the question of social reproduction, and we talked about that in one of the sessions we had earlier, is in itself a very, very important question with a great deal of diversity. So here is, I think, the kind of critical situation that for a capitalist mode of production to work effectively, it has to integrate into its circulation process this small circulation process that Marx talks about. Why he calls it small, I don't know, because it's pretty big to me, and in fact, it's a pretty huge undertaking. But what I think that this means is that the worker and the working person is not just simply located in any one of these moments. The working person actually moves from one moment to another moment. And what that means is that that movement from one moment to another is a very strong transition which takes place in the kind of experiential world of the worker. And this is, I think, a very interesting way of thinking about things. And one of the things that also happens, and this is true also as Marx sets up his theory of circulation and moments and the general circulation of capital, is that the moments cannot be understood independent of each other. That is, there is a way in which there is a relationality being established between social reproduction, the moment of utilization of the capacity to labor, the moment of consumption and the like, that these are all integral to each other, and therefore we have to think about the totality. And I again come back to this notion several times of totality. Within the totality, if we take this circulation process as one of the totalities that enters into the grand totality of the whole circulation of capital, then this totality has these different moments which are integrated to each other and which affect each other. That is, what happens in the labor process and the kind of things that happen to individuals within the labor process get translated, if you like, to the kind of things that go on in social reproduction. In other words, it's not as if the capitalist, the worker in the labor process, just does that and then goes back and is totally unaffected by the experience of the labor process. No, in fact, that people take back from the labor process certain things that are going on in the labor process, and they bring them back into the world of social reproduction, so that the world of social reproduction starts to get reshaped in relationship to the processes which are going on in the production process. Now, but the same thing goes in the reverse direction. It's not as if relationality is all one way. What goes on in the world of social reproduction affects profoundly the sorts of ways in which things are set up within the labor process. We see this very clearly, things like gender assignments. We see this very clearly in many other respects. And so when we're looking at this circulation process of labor, we're looking at it and recognizing that each moment has its own distinctive character, but each moment is to some degree or other internalizing impulses, effects, and so on from all of the other moments. That is, what somebody does in the world of production is not independent of the kinds of choices they might have in the consumer markets. The experience of the labor market is not, as it were, separated out from the experiences of social reproduction, because when you go into the labor market, again, there are all these distinctions which may be set up, all these cultural features, the question of women's labor versus men's labor, the question of racial distinctions, ethnicity and religion, all those sorts of things. So there's a cross flow of influences between these different moments of production, different moments within the circulation process, and that this cross flow, I think, is something which is a very significant feature. So if I sat down in a particular world situation, say I went to Nigeria or something of that kind, and was asked to sort of do some research on, okay, what's going on in Nigeria. One of the things I would want to do is to say, well, I want to look at how this circulation process, the delivery of labor into the general process works, and how these different moments are constructed. Are they differently constructed in Nigeria than they are in Britain? And actually, what you find is that the labor, the kind of the world of the worker and the working person is very, very different in Alabama from what it is in Massachusetts or in New England. There may be similarities and differences, but this is a very interesting way to start to set up a research project on the conditions of labor. Because the condition of labor it's not simply about what's happening to the laborer in the labor process. It's also about labor markets. It has to be also about their possibilities of money managers and money organizers and financiers, their capacity into as buyers and consumers, and their activities in the in the domestic sphere and the like. So, to me, the structure that Marx sets out here is interesting, because it starts to immediately tells me what it is I should be looking at, and what it is the questions I should be asking about labour processes in order to understand something about the life of the typical working person in a typical situation. And so it's a good research tool and a good way to start to think about exactly how to understand the lives of the workers and what it means to be working for capitalism and living under capitalism. So why don't I just stop here, because the next part is, I think, going to build even further on this in a rather different direction.
Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.